While we waited, a woman was locked down with her abuser.
While we waited, a girl was forced out of school.
While we waited, a mother fed her children, not herself.
In the year the world stopped,
Women's rights were reversed, undoing years of progress. Just like that.
As the world begins to turn again,
we must begin to act.
For the 1 in 3 women who have experienced violence in their lifetime.
For the 47 million more women being pushed into extreme poverty because of the pandemic.
For the 50% of the population
who deserve 50% of the power.
This year, leaders and changemakers will meet at the Generation Equality Forum.
A forum to build up and strengthen women's rights for generations to come.
Let's show that we're standing up
so equality can step forward.
And in a year where it's virtually impossible to meet, we'll meet virtually.
Don't wait. It's time to act for equal.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
How are you? Hope everyone is doing fine. All of us are going through a very difficult time. So it's very important to keep us safe and fine. A very warm welcome to all of you. This is Shalini Singh, and I'm the Director of Programs and Innovation at CREA and based in Delhi, India. We are also a leader of this Action Coalition. I'm very happy and honored to be the moderator today. So I will be working with you, presenting today till 11:30. For the whole session, I will be continuing and I will be present here. The video you just saw gives an excellent introduction to the framework for this dialogue. Today, we aim to serve as a conversation. We try to start a conversation for the proposed area of action under this Global Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership. This webinar is organized by the UN Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Headquarters, and the regional offices for the Pacific and Southeast Asia as part of the Global Generational Equality Campaign. As you know, all of you, it started in March in Mexico City and will culminate in June 21 in Paris. This process is actually bringing together leaders from all over the places, from governments, civil society, private sector, philanthropic organizations, and the UN Women. UN Women will be making commitments aimed at accelerating action on equality, leadership, and opportunity for women and girls worldwide. Today, we will have also the opportunity to hear from a number of Action Coalition leaders, including OSCHR, International Women's Development Agency, and Open Society Foundation. These leaders have actually come together with many other committed partners and stakeholders so that women and girls and all non-binary people are supported to become more sustainable. They can carry out their work without fear and advance gender equality, peace, and human rights for all. In addition to this, we will also be hearing from leaders from diverse backgrounds, from diverse sectors, who will be sharing how they have been engaging in advancing women's rights and their experiences from their faiths, what they have learned, what they are doing, how different strategies they are using. We hope, and I sincerely hope, that this will also set the frame for some interesting discussions on key priorities and opportunities for collaboration to accelerate action within Asia-Pacific region. We are sure that you will leave this dialogue very inspired and motivated by the different experiences and knowledge shared today to build on our work together. Today, we will begin our session with opening remarks, and after that, we will also unpack the areas of concern. We will then set the framework for a presentation on the 4 ambitious action areas, which will be shared by International Women's Development Agency. These actions to advance feminist organizations and time to leverage the SDG framework and contribute to the target. After that, we will also then shift gear, and participants will have a good opportunity to take a deep dive into these 4 different areas. Through discussions with experts, leaders from different fields like academia, civil society, private sector, and the UN and different foundations, we will learn what we can do. We will discuss regionally how we can advance this agenda. And participants will be also able to choose which session to join and work with the group so that they can come up with recommendations and then reflect it back in plenary. After this session, we will have an opportunity to hear about what and how we can take action, different opportunities for engagement. So I am sure you will leave this dialogue after the end very inspired and energized to continue our work in fighting for women's rights and movement everywhere. Before we start the session, actually, I wanted to share some housekeeping rules. So I will request everyone to keep, please, your microphone on mute while you are not speaking. And for better bandwidth and unless requests, please could you also keep your camera off. But whenever speakers are asked to speak, they should switch on their camera so that everybody is able to see them. Please try to follow the agenda and time. And if you have any questions or any information you want to share, please don't hesitate to write in the chat box. My colleague Lara will be your online moderator. So please feel free to write any questions and comments in the chat box, and we will try to answer or address these questions, all those questions throughout the program. For convenience of many other people, like the closed captions have been also enabled. So I just wanted to share this information that closed caption will not be working in the breakout rooms, but you can, however, enable them in your Zoom settings in the bottom of the screen in the plenary. We will also be providing translation in different language, which is mainly, so there will be English International Sign Language interpretation and interpretation in Mandarin, Bahasa, and Hindi. Please check the Zoom chat for guidance on how to work with this and how to access different language services. So this is the housekeeping rule, but in case you have any confusion, feel free to write in the Zoom chat box. With this, I think we should now start the session. It is my great pleasure to introduce our co-host, beginning with Mohammad Nasiri, who is Regional Director of UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Mohammad, over to you. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. This is Sarah Nibbs from the Asia Pacific Regional Office of UN Women. And I have to send a very, very sincere solidarity and apology from Mohammed, who is unfortunately unable to join, but I have the honor to be here in his place. So if it's okay, Shalini, I will give some opening remarks from you.
Yeah, please. Thanks a lot, Sarah, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Shalini. So good morning, everybody. And I know for some people it's already good afternoon and good evening. We really are grateful to you for making time to join this dialogue. As I said already, my name is Sarah Nibbs, and I'm the Deputy Regional Director of UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. And it gives me really great pleasure to welcome you to the 5th in a series of virtual regional dialogues through which we seek to amplify the Generation Equality Forum agenda in the Asia and Pacific region. As you know, today's dialogue is on feminist movements and leadership. So it brings together stakeholders from government, civil society, including, of course, women's rights organizations, collectives, and feminist activists, private sector, academia, and the UN. This is one, as I said, of a series of dialogues. Our first focused on feminist action for climate justice, and we held it on Earth Day, followed by dialogues around technology and innovation, economic justice and rights, and gender-based violence just this week. The Generation Equality Forum is a process that kicked off in Mexico City in March 2021, and it will be culminating with a very exciting event in Paris at the end of this month that will be presided over by President Emmanuel Macron. And we do hope that many of you will have the opportunity to join that event virtually, because of course, in this age that we're living in right now, everything is open to us virtually, as well as the many constraints that we have that opportunity. So I think you can find more information from my colleagues about how to register, so please take part. So the forum, the Generation Equality Forum, which is co-convened with the governments of France and Mexico, has very important objectives: to spur financial and policy commitments, to promote a very diverse and powerful coalition fueled by intergenerational movement of people and organizations, and really also to drive widespread public attention and mobilization around the issues of generation equality, as we've come to 25 years, as you know, after the Beijing Platform for Action that was such a landmark in the struggle for women's rights. And we hope this will be an opportunity to really push once again for significant and lasting change for gender equality and women's empowerment. And as part of that, more than 80 member states of the UN, private sector organizations, international civil society, youth-led organizations have been actively engaged in shaping the forum's call to action by leading action coalitions in 6 different areas, including the one that we will focus on today on feminist movements and leadership. These action coalitions are innovative, multi-stakeholder partnerships that aim to mobilize governments, civil society, international organizations, and the private sector to really catalyze action, investment, and deliver concrete results that will make a real difference for gender equality and the empowerment of women. So for today's dialogue, I'm very honored that we're joined by the leaders of this action coalition, which include the dialogue's co-organizer, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, Creating Resources for Empowerment in Action, CREA, the International Women's Development Agency, IWDA, and Open Society Foundation, OSF. We look forward to hear from our Action Coalition leaders in the course of the dialogue. The other leaders of this Action Coalition include the governments of Canada, Malawi, and the Netherlands, the Association for Women's Rights in Development, the Interparliamentary Union, Women Political Leaders, WPL, the United Cities and Local Governments, and Young Feminists Europe, among others. So you can see the kind of exciting and diverse opportunity that we have here, with all of these different stakeholders really coming together to talk about feminist leadership and movement building. I'm very pleased to be able to open this dialogue together with OHCHR's regional representative in the Pacific, Heike Alafson. We're also joined by the regional representative for OHCHR's Southeast Asia Regional Office, Cynthia Veliko, and OHCHR's headquarters team. And Cynthia will be facilitating one of our breakout room sessions later this morning. This dialogue is particularly important for this region at a time when some countries in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific are experiencing a significant increase in the number of individuals and families affected by COVID-19. So we are particularly appreciative of today's speakers and participants for making time for this dialogue to discuss how we can work together to ensure that stakeholders play their role in enabling women, girls, and their communities to address the exceptional hardships linked to this pandemic. We are well aware of the issues that have arisen during COVID-19, and indeed the way that issues that already existed have been deepened and worsened. We've seen increased violence against women and girls. We've seen a rise in school dropout rates among girls. We've seen increased care responsibilities, and we've seen an increase in child marriages. We are seeing women driven into poverty as they lose their jobs at a higher rate than men, and pay the price for a lack of digital access and skills that have become so crucial for engagement in many spheres of life at this time. So this dialogue will focus on a number of critical issues. First, the representation of women in public life, in leadership and decision-making spaces and processes, and of course also the representation of other historically marginalized groups. Secondly, the protection and promotion of the spaces for feminist-led organizations and movements. And thirdly, the promotion of the practice of feminist principles in leadership and in decision-making. While advances have been made both globally and regionally in the representation of women in leadership in different sectors, as noted in the joint UNESGAP and UN Women Regional Synthesis report based on the Beijing Plus 25 reports of various countries that was launched earlier this year, we also recognise that progress has been slow and uneven due to cultural and attitudinal barriers, policy and legislative hurdles, and limited financial investments. So, for example, by the end of 2020, the percentage of seats held by women in national parliaments stood at 25% globally, but actually at 20% in the Asia Pacific region. And this milestone took 2 decades to achieve. In terms of women's representation in local government, by the end of 2020, this was below the global average of 36% in 86% of our countries in Asia Pacific. And when it comes to women in managerial positions in the region's private sector, by 2019, this stood at around 24%, compared to a global average of almost 28%. So these statistics do present a worrying picture. The representation of women and other historically excluded groups in public life and decision-making is critical, not only as a matter of human rights, but also as the primary way through which decisions, institutions, and funding decisions will be responsive to the needs and priorities of the whole population. This agenda has become more urgent as we reflect on lessons learned in the context of COVID-19, where we saw how systemic inequalities have served to both exacerbate the crisis and to complicate and delay the path to recovery for countries. Women's rights organisations are a critical avenue through which women have demonstrated their leadership in crisis. Women have supported their government partners in advancing policies and laws which promote gender equality, have played a role in plugging critical service gaps, and have ensured that the voices of marginalised groups are heard. Yet they are continually challenged by shrinking civic space and limited funding opportunities. Changing this current reality will require stronger commitment and collective action in this region to remove barriers associated with regressive social norms, lack of education and resources, among many others. And to achieve this, partnerships like those that can be fostered through these action coalitions will be essential. In Paris later this month, the forum's conveners will unveil a global acceleration plan for gender equality, will formally launch the 6 action coalitions and a compact for women, peace and security and humanitarian action. By focusing on a shared plan of concrete and transformative actions, the Paris Forum will mobilise high-level change makers to propel lasting gender equality. It will also result in strengthened multi-stakeholder movements for gender equality. So as I mentioned earlier, we do invite you to register for that forum and to consider committing to this action coalition after learning more today. But meanwhile, once again, we're so grateful to see such a diverse group represented here today, and we're very excited about the conversation that will take place. So thank you once again, everyone, and I'm very excited to see the conversation this morning. Over to you, Shalini.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, for giving us welcoming words and also giving us some broader background about the Generation Equality Forum and also role of UN Women in convening this forum and also work in this area. Thanks a lot. So our next speaker will be Heike Al-Fessen, who is Regional Representative, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for the Pacific. Heike, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Shalini, and an excellent morning, afternoon, and evening to all the participants. This Generation Equality Forum is meant to deliberately break up the old normal, so I want to thank all of you who are joining us in this virtual new normal. Globally, the UN Human Rights Office that I represent in the Pacific is honored to co-lead the Generation Equality Action Coalition on feminist movements and leadership, and that we are able to join forces with civil society partners and UN Women and other UN agencies in dialoguing with many diverse and inspirational leaders from academia, from civil society, from states, from international and regional organizations, and from the private sector in this region. So Generation Equality is all about action. It's about accelerating towards the implementation of the commitment under the Beijing Platform for Action, under commitments towards women's human rights in core UN conventions, and also, of course, under the Sustainable Development Goals. And the forum is also about building better, not back, but better, in a gender-responsive manner so that the pandemic legacy is not a further millstone around women and girls' necks. We would like to highlight a few trends. We're still obviously on a very long and unfinished path towards gender equality and women's rights, but the commitment and advocacy of feminist movements and leaders, including human rights defenders in all of their diversity in the Asia-Pacific region, have yielded quite a few advances. Their collective power must be recognized as a driving force for the realization of human rights globally and in our region, Asia Pacific. We have seen tangible progress ranging from enhanced constitutional provisions that guarantee gender equality in some countries of our region, repeal of discriminatory laws, high-level government policy commitments, and increased and almost universal ratification, with a few pockets still here in the Pacific, of key human rights standards of CEDAW. In the past couple of years, feminist activists from all walks of life and identities have also been at the forefront of key advocacy efforts, globally exposing widespread gender-based violence, including through Me Too and other movements, and protecting their right to decide whom to love and how to identify, and protecting sexual and reproductive rights in the face of resistance. And women and girls have been and continue to be at the heart of social justice movements against corruption, against discrimination and equality, and including 4 initiatives that particularly resonate in our region here to protect our planet, the environment, and to urge those who contribute to the climate crisis to act now. So while this progress is really unquestionable, it has also been uneven and slow. And let me digress here for a moment for a personal remark, because I'm struck by this. Uneven and slow is something that I remember was our conclusion when I was working for one of the predecessors of UN Women, maybe 17, 16 years ago, and we were preparing in New York the Beijing +10 review. So our conclusion for the big UN report that came out at the time was progress has been uneven and slow. And here we are, 15 years later, more than 25 years after the Beijing Platform for Action, almost 30 years after the adoption of the Vienna Declaration and Program for Action, adopted at the UN Human Rights Conference, and more than 40 years after the adoption of the CEDAW Convention. And still today, there's not a single country that can claim to have achieved true gender equality. So that is quite a stark conclusion, I think. But let's look at some of the other achievements and challenges, and I have a couple of statistics for us, because we do have other achievements, as I've mentioned. We are witnessing the highest number of countries that are headed by women and largest global share of women ministers that we've ever seen. Yet, this translates to only 21 states out of 192, and only 14 that have at least parity in their cabinets. We heard from our Deputy Director of UN Women here that in 2020, only 20% of the seats in national parliaments in Asia Pacific region were held by women, compared to 25% global average. And in the Pacific, it is even lower. It was 8.4% in February this year. The 2020 Pacific review of the Beijing Platform for Action highlighted that, with the exception of the French territories, the Pacific states still have a very long way to go to achieve balanced representation of women, and that temporary special measures, such as quotas, are only used in a few states. Obviously, we have also seen that in many professions that were once close to women, women now hold decision-making positions. In 2018, globally, women made up 45% of the public administration workforce, but only 34% of decision-making positions. Globally, women still earn less than men for work of the same value, and they continue to be expected to take on disproportionate caregiving responsibilities, especially during this pandemic, which have led many to lose their jobs and future employment opportunities. And during this pandemic, we have also unfortunately seen that women remain absent at the table when it comes to deciding on the use of governmental resources in response and recovery from COVID-19, which is reflected in what countries prioritize and what they don't prioritize. There's been an interesting statistic of 225 COVID-19 task forces across 137 countries. Only 24% of members were women. Yet they and many of them are at the front lines of COVID. Over 70% of the health task forces in most countries are women. And according to data from the end of 2020, only about 10 of the total fiscal, economic, social protection and jobs responses addressed women's economic security as a response to COVID. And only 8% of the social protection and labor market measures directly addressed unpaid care. So globally, feminist leaders, movements, organizations have been doing and working from positions of power to ensure that there is mobilization in the streets. Recent report by UN Women counted that there was 3,000 protests during the period of the pandemic. And there is obviously also an unprecedented and collective demand for online civic space. Yet there are concerns that have become particularly evident in the pandemic, namely the shrinking space globally and overall, and also in our region, and restrictions on freedom of association and expression. And the pioneers for gender equality continue to be underfunded and excluded from positions of power. OECD found before the pandemic that less than 1% of global DAC aid for gender equality and women's empowerment was going to women's coalitions and women's equality organizations. In the Pacific and South Asia, in particular, we continue to face some of the highest rates of violence, and there are continued concerns about access to customary land rights. LGBTIQ persons continue to be marginalized and face discrimination. Globally, gender power dynamics disadvantage women and as decision makers. And in our region, in Asia and Pacific, we see that the social cultural norms often see men as the natural spokespersons for women, communities, and governments. So we can conclude that gender equality remains essentially a question of power. So those who control power, resources, and influence should be and must be the champions of gender equality and of generation equality. Attaining equality between women and men and eliminating all forms of discrimination are fundamental human rights. And this is not a question of us versus them. It's a question of inclusion and fairness. And so we invite everyone, governments, institutions, organizations, and especially all men and boys, to be our feminist partners in protecting and promoting the human rights of all women and girls. And let me be clear, I did not intend to sound bleak here with these remarks. A lot has indeed been achieved, and there is a lot to be thankful for, a lot to celebrate, including our incredible global movement, our collective strength and voice, and the agency and power and the solidarity. But we must recognize the urgency for change and for continued investment in gender equality. And there must be a resurgence of feminist power that drives this. So, to come to the conclusion, the pandemic is a human and also societal tragedy, but we have the remarkable once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change course, to change economic and social models, which are based on exclusion and inequality. As I said, not to build back, but to recover better than we were before. Generation equality is the siren call that we all need to hear and act on together. And the launch of this Generation Equality Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leaderships comes at a truly opportune moment to recognize, bolster, and to catalyze feminist movements and leadership. And I thank everyone who makes it possible and encourage everybody to join us and to support our collective vision for a better and more equal and just world. And globally, we will be making some commitments as OHCHR as the co-leader of the Action Coalition. My colleagues from our headquarters will be able to speak more to that so that we can make these efforts in the next 5 years towards greater justice, gender equality, and the full realization of all women and girls' human rights. So I hope that in this event today, feminist activists from all ages, all genders, all diverse identities and all justice movements represented here will generate good discussions. And I'd like to thank the organizers, all our civil society partners, UN Women, and my own OHCHR colleagues for making this event a reality. Thank you very much for your attention, and over to you and back to you, Shalini. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Heike, for giving us an overview about the current situation, the challenges we have faced, and the progress we have made till now. But it was very good to hear that how you are also emphasizing on becoming more like creating a more enabling environment for women, girls, and all non-binary people, so that other people who are maybe right now not part of this process can also join this process and make this process more stronger and strengthened by joining and contributing to this process. Thanks a lot. Thanks again. So at this point, I think it will be really helpful and good for us also to understand and hear more about the areas of action that have informed this action coalition work. So to start this section, actually unpacking the areas of concern, I just wanted to invite Bronwyn Tilbury, who is the Feminist Movement Strengthening Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency. She is based in Australia. Bronwyn, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Shalini. I hope you can see, I've just shared my screen. Is that working? Great, great. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me here today. As Shalini said, my name's Bronwyn Tilbury, and I'm the Feminist Movement Strengthening Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency. I'm speaking to you today from Lutruwita, which is the traditional lands of the Palawa people, also known as Hobart, Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to the Palawa people on whose unceded land I'm joining you from today. For those of you who don't know RWDA, we are an Australian-based organisation resourcing diverse women's rights organisations, primarily in Asia and the Pacific, and contributing to global feminist movements to advance our vision of gender equality for all. We exist to defend and advance the rights of diverse women and girls. RWDA has been one of the few representatives of the Asia and Pacific region on the Action Coalition leadership structure, and we have been trying really hard to keep our networks and allies across this region informed and included in the process of the Action Coalition and generation equality more broadly. And so I'm really excited to see so many of you here today at this Asia Pacific specific event, which I think really represents growing momentum around generation equality in our region, which is really great to see. I'm honoured to have been asked to unpack the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership. We have 4 areas of concern. Before I do that, though, I wanted to acknowledge IWDA's co-leaders on the Action Coalition, who we've been working with for the last year or so to develop the blueprint I'm about to tell you about. So from civil society, we have CREA, Gender Links for Equality and Justice in South Africa, Women Enabled International, Asamblea Nacional Política de Mujeres Indígenas, based in Mexico. Our youth-led organizations are Young Feminists Europe and the Marianne Foundation. From private sector, we have Gucci. The international organizations are International Parliamentary Union, United Cities and Local Governments, Women Political Leaders. And then the member states are Malawi, Canada, and the Netherlands, who joined our Action Coalition in consortium with Philanthropy Advancing Women's Human Rights, the Count Me In Initiative, Equality Fund, and Prospera. And last but definitely not least, the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, UNOHCHR. And along the whole way, we've been coordinated by UN Women. And I'd like to thank both UN Women and OHCHR for hosting this regional dialogue today. Each of these organisations that I've just listed has been engaged in consultations and engagement with our constituencies to feed into and develop this blueprint. And so I'd like to acknowledge and thank the feminist leaders, activists, and women's human rights defenders and other movements representatives whose voices also shape this blueprint. Many of you are here in the room today, so thank you. So I'll now take you through the blueprint itself. Here is the vision for feminist movements and leadership that we have developed together. And I just wanted to invite you to close your eyes for a moment and picture these words as I read them. We envision that by 2026, feminist leaders and activists, women's human rights defenders and their movements and organisations, including but not limited to those led by trans, intersex, non-binary people, racialized people, Indigenous women, women and persons with disabilities, women and persons living with and affected by HIV, young feminists, girls, sex workers, and other historically marginalized people, regardless of their status before the law, are fully resourced and supported to become sustainable, can carry out their work without fear of reprisal, and advance gender equality, justice, peace, and human rights for all from an intersectional approach. Thank you. You can open your eyes now, but I'd invite you to keep that vision in your mind's eye. So now let's unpack that a little bit. I'd like to draw your attention to some of the core principles that the Action Coalition has been able to agree on and that underpin the blueprint, and also our vision for how this work will be done over the next 5 years and beyond. So when we use the term feminist-led organisations and movements, we are referring to activists, women's human rights defenders and groups who A, work from feminist and women's rights perspectives, B, are led by the people they serve, C, have the promotion of women's, girls, and or all trans, intersex and non-binary people's human rights as their primary mission, D, push for structural change and address issues at their roots, and those who work on issues which are marginalised and contested. I think it's important to note here that while an organisation may not identify explicitly as feminist, they may still be working from a feminist or a women's rights perspective, and so they are also included in this definition. A second core principle is a commitment to an intersectional analysis. That is an acknowledgement that varying circumstances and conditions mean that diverse women and girls are varyingly located along axes of power, privilege and oppression, and also differ in their status before the law. We've tried to apply these principles of intersectionality across the blueprint and highlight the importance of inclusion of historically marginalised people and groups as both agents and beneficiaries of the change that we're envisioning. The blueprint and our Action Coalition also commit to a transformative agenda which goes beyond the gender binary and explicitly includes non-binary, trans and intersex people, including those who don't identify as women, in recognition that these groups are also oppressed and marginalised by harmful gender norms and gendered systems of power. Throughout the blueprint, we refer to feminist movements in all their diversity. And by this, we mean that feminist and women's rights movements are diverse and led by diverse people everywhere. This includes trans, intersex, non-binary people, racialized people, Indigenous women, women and persons with disabilities, women and persons living with and affected by HIV, young feminists, girls, sex workers, and other historically marginalized people. We wanted to acknowledge that these groups have faced stigma, racism, and discrimination within society in general, but that they have also been sidelined within feminist movements themselves, and that this is unacceptable and must stop. One of the foundational principles of generation equality, as well as the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership, has been a deep commitment to the co-leadership and co-ownership of young feminists and girls in all change processes, in recognition of their invaluable contribution to feminist change making. As part of this commitment, we have been working closely with a group of girls facilitated by Plan International to develop Action Area 4 of the blueprint. And of course, we have the young feminist organisations as part of the Action Coalition leadership. While our Action Coalition has a specific action area focusing on young feminists, we're also calling on commitments and commitment makers to apply the principles of co-ownership and co-leadership with girls and young feminists horizontally across the whole action, all of the action areas. And finally, when talking about feminist leadership, we were clear within the Action Coalition that it is about who holds power, yes, but also, and more importantly, what they do with that power. So while we see gender parity within positions of power and decision-making as very important, it's not sufficient to realise feminist leadership. Rather, we go a step further to call for leaders, no matter their gender, to build feminist principles of power sharing, inclusivity, intersectionality, and participatory methodologies into their practices of leadership. So what are the action areas that the blueprint highlights as the most game-changing, transformative areas for action over the next 5 years? Well, we identified 4 key action areas. You see them there on the slides. One refers to resourcing feminist movements, civic space, feminist leadership, and young feminist and girl-led movements. Each action area has a goal, which is an ambitious target for our collective work over the next 5 years. And then there are various tactics that are spelt out with examples of potential commitments under each action area. And I encourage you to go away and read the acceleration plan yourself in detail. But I'll give you a summary of what's in there. So action area 1 focuses on resourcing for feminist movements. We know that feminist organizations and movements remain chronically under-resourced. Women's rights organizations and movements receive less than 1% of ODA, as has been mentioned already today, committed for gender equality and women's empowerment. And similarly, little funding comes from philanthropy. If the global community is serious about achieving gender equality, we must dramatically increase the amount of core, flexible, multi-year and sustainable funding that goes directly to diverse feminist organizations and movements now. So in action area 1, we envision that by 2026, we will have at least doubled the global annual growth rate of funding from all sectors committed to women-led, girl-led and feminist-led movements, organizations and funds in all their diversity, especially to those led by historically marginalized women and people, including trans, intersex and non-binary people. Currently, the global annual growth rate of funding committed to these groups is 4%. And so by 2026, we're calling for this to have doubled to an 8% global annual growth rate of funding to these groups. So in terms of tactics within this area, we're wanting to increase funding to feminist activists, organizations and movements, of course, but also ensuring that we don't just grow the amount of funding reaching these groups, but that the type of funding available to feminist groups upholds feminist principles. In that it is trust-based, it's core, flexible, multi-year and sustainable funding. And we're also calling for greater transparency around the flows of money to feminist activists, organizations and movements, so that we have a clearer picture of how much and what type of funding these groups have access to. Action area 2 focuses on the promotion, expansion, strengthening and protection of civic space. So as we know, feminist activists, organizations and women's human rights defenders are under attack and are impeded by the fact that anti-gender and anti-rights forces, which are often avidly anti-feminist in their agenda, are gathering momentum globally, especially as COVID-19 has given many authoritarian actors cover to crack down on civic space even further. These forces are increasingly well-funded and well-organised, and this has resulted in further contraction of civic space, both online and offline, attacks and violence, and reprisals for those who resist these forces. And so our goal for this action area is to promote, expand, strengthen and protect civic space across all domains, including online, to support the efforts of feminist activists in all their diversity, to defend civic space and eliminate barriers to feminist action, organising and mobilisation in all its diversity. In terms of tactics, the blueprint calls for the advancement of protection measures, policies and enforceable legislation to protect the human rights and security of women human rights defenders. It calls for human rights violations to be monitored, documented and reported ethically and using disaggregated data. And it also speaks to the need to deepen solidarity within feminist movements and between social justice movements more broadly in order to eliminate harmful gender norms, stereotypes and practices. Women's representation, as we've heard this morning already, in national parliaments grew from only 12% in 1995 to an average of 25.5% in 2020. So at this rate, we'll reach gender parity in national legislative bodies by about 2063, which is 52 years from now. We also know that feminist leadership offers new, transformative and innovative approaches that model broader participation of diverse partners and a greater commitment to democratic principles towards creating long-lasting and sustainable solutions to inequality and inequity. And so our Action Area 3 goal aims to advance substantive representation and increase the meaningful participation of leadership and decision-making power of girls and youth leaders and of women and feminist leaders in all their diversity, including those who are trans, intersex and non-binary, through efforts to advance gender parity and the inclusion of those historically marginalised in all aspects, sectors and levels of public and economic decision-making, and B, promote and expand feminist, gender transformative, intersectional approaches to decision-making and leadership, which acknowledge, analyse and challenge existing power relations and advance inclusive, gender transformative and rights-affirming laws and policies. So the first part of this action area focuses on achieving gender parity through developing and implementing laws and policies to advance gender parity and meaningful participation, collecting and disseminating data on the participation of women, girls, trans, intersex and non-binary people in decision-making, building in cross-sector alliances and support for feminist leaders, and addressing harmful stereotypes and gender norms to ensure that decision-making power and leadership for feminist activists, organisations and movements is possible. And then in terms of tactics around the second area in this action area, the second part of this focuses on feminist approaches to decision and policy making, which promote principles of participation, democracy, equality, human rights and justice. We know that feminist movements have been working for decades to combat the damaging consequences of neo-colonial, neoliberal and patriarchal trade, defence and international development policies. And that's why our blueprint explicitly calls for the adoption of feminist foreign policies. It also calls for the collection of disaggregated data, including gender-sensitive multidimensional poverty data and intersectional feminist analysis in preparation, implementation and monitoring of policies, budgets and laws, as well as an investment in gender transformative, intercultural and intersectional approaches to gender budgeting mechanisms. And our final action area relates to young feminists and girl-led movements. We are calling on the international community to allocate, monitor and evaluate specific, flexible, financial, technical and other resources to adolescent girls and young feminist leaders and their movements and organisations to strengthen them and create safe and inclusive spaces to lead, share ownership and substantively participate in and co-create decision-making processes. We want to see donor practices transform to include dedicated core and flexible funding streams that meet the needs of these groups. We want to institutionalise the safe, inclusive and meaningful participation, leadership and co-ownership of adolescent girls and young feminists. We want to increase disaggregated data and research on the nature of young feminists and girls organising. And we want to see a greater investment in creative initiatives that strengthen co-learning and critical thinking skills and tools for girls and young feminists. So there you have it. The results of countless hours of drafting and redrafting, many 1 a.m. Zoom calls for me, debates and discussions, collaboration, convening, engagement with constituencies, and a few jokes and relationships made along the way. I truly hope it speaks to you and your political agendas and your contexts and movements and communities. And I'd just like to thank you again for taking the time to come and engage with this movement. It really is over to us all now to make this vision a reality. So I really look forward to hearing your thoughts in the breakout room. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Bronwyn. Thanks a lot for this thought-provoking presentation and also all unpacking the areas of concern. You have given a good overview about our also focus area where we need to work more and how also it will be good. It was good to listen and how we are also planning to evaluate all the progresses. Thanks once again. So now next session will be our breakout room. So we will soon be launching 4 breakout rooms, which will talk about different action areas. And we will also have an opportunity to hear from a number of inspiring leaders who are doing their work in what they are doing in their region and their work experience, what are some of the critical priority areas. So before going to that, our breakout rooms, I think we should also do a Zoom poll. So may I request our team members to launch a Zoom poll so that after that we can talk about breakout rooms. So I request everyone to participate in the Zoom poll. Hope everyone is participating in the poll. Can we see the result? Okay, so 27% participants have suggested funds and support for feminist and women-led organizations. 13% have said create, expand, and protect civic spaces. 39% participants want advance and increase meaningful participation, leadership, and decision-making power of women, girls, and non-binary people. And 20% people want to strengthen adults and girls-led, youth-led, and youth-serving movements and organizations. Thanks a lot. So now next, we should move to the next segment. I would also request our team to share the list of breakout rooms and all facilitators and discussant. So everyone, we will have 4 breakout rooms, and all different action rooms are talking about different areas of concerns. Action room 1 is talking about fund and support, and Nikita is going to facilitate the whole process. There will be Shivanti Thanenthiran, discussant, and Wangshu Lian. Action room 2 will be facilitated by Cynthia Veliko, and Rachana and Sharanya will be there. Action room 3 will be facilitated by Joy Chia, and Nalini Singh and Vandana Rane will join as a discussant. Action room 4 will be facilitated by Raylene Dela Pais, and Yasmin and Satoko will join as a discussant. All participants will have a choice to join any breakout rooms wherever you feel and you want to join. So I just wanted to also remind once again that closed captioning will not be working in the breakout rooms. And there will be time alerts for you, 20 minutes to go, 10 minutes to go, and 5 minutes to go. So please keep a check on time. I would also request everyone to please, before entering the breakout rooms, check the breakout room icon. In who are not familiar with this process, check the breakout room icon, and it will pop up at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. And please click through it and select which room you would like to enter by hovering near the room 1, 2, 3, 4, and then click join. You will have total 40 minutes, so I am not repeating, but you are requested to actually focus on some of the 3 to 5 top recommendations. 2-3 priority actions for this region based on the discussion under you have joined the breakout rooms, and region which will be guided by the action coalition, feminist movements and leadership areas of action, and where you want to focus some of the things for next 5 years. Total 2 recommendations we are looking for, which can be related to strategies or opportunities for strengthening our multi-stakeholder intra-regional collaboration and also collective action. So now we will be launching the breakout room so people can choose where they want to join.
Hello from Cambodia. I am Generation Equality because I believe everyone is equal. I am who I am, and I make my own decision.
I want to break through social norms, stigma, and gender stereotypes.
I believe in the power in our generation. We can put an end out of all discrimination against women.
I believe everyone has the right to tell their story to the world.
I believe in the power of women's collective voices, so let's speak up and empower one another.
I want gender equality in the workplaces. I strongly believe women's place is everywhere.
I want to participate fully in the society and encourage people with disability to live with dignity and opportunity.
We,
the Breakout team, our Generation Equality,
Our generation equality.
Our generation equality.
Our generation equality.
How about you?
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good session, enjoyable and fruitful. So before we start presentation from all the group members, I also wanted to just really sincerely appreciate everyone for their contribution, for their support in this process. And also a special thanks to all facilitators and discussants for starting and helping set the groundwork of the discussion. So all group members, all facilitators who were leading the discussion will be given 5 to 7 minutes per group to discuss, to share their recommendations. And also if anybody has any comments and questions, feel free to add in the chat box. So for 5 and 7 minute presentation, I will start inviting all group members one by one, and we will follow the same number 1, 2, 3, 4. So I will be beginning with group number 1, who discussed fund and support feminist and women-led organizations and activists and movements. We have today Nikita Patodia, who is from Women's Fund Asia, and she will present key highlights of their discussion and recommendations. Nikita, over to you.
Thank you, Shalini. And hello, everyone. We had, in our action room, we discussed the existing challenges, some of which that emerged were that in the global funding landscape, Asia and Pacific region has long been deprioritized, especially when we look at the narrative that usually surrounds Asia Pacific. It is often of economic progress and an emerging market for the global economies. However, this is an inaccurate narrative when it comes to understanding the challenges and the marginalizations of women, girls, trans, intersex, non-binary people and communities within which they live and the work that they lead. So this we identified as a catch-22 situation that needs to change. Another big challenge that we discussed was that a lot of the funding that does come into Asia still comes in from a very traditional approach through a handful of NGOs and traditional donors who we discussed that funding modality as well as the way that funding is coming needs to change. We discussed there needs to be a decolonization lens that needs to be applied by the big funders into how they are bringing in money and how that money is being then, where it is reaching and how it is reaching there. And the third big challenge we discussed was that funding for rights is still very low. So this creates a very unique, challenging situation within which a lot of the activists and leaders then have to work. Moving to recommendations, all our recommendations are tied to these challenges we discussed. So our first recommendation is that the funding community needs to look at the gaps that already exist within the Asia Pacific region and we demand that the funding should be increased for the region, and funding the quantity as well as the quality of the funding both need to increase. So we need more funding that is going towards gender equality as a principal objective, as well as that is going directly to the self-led and grassroots groups that are working for justice and equality. We also discussed a recommendation that emerged was that all the funding that does come in needs to be rooted in the feminist principles. And the core of this is redistributing power to those who are marginalized and discriminated against. And one of the ways of doing this is directing more funding towards their leadership and the work that they're doing. We also discussed the transformatory potential within participatory grant making as a method to shift power. And one of the ways in which participatory grant making does it is by acknowledging and not avoiding power hierarchies and dynamics. So we urge the global funding community to look at participatory grant making as a modality and develop it with stakeholders who are essentially activists and groups that are already demonstrating how this is working within their communities. We also discussed the need to work with funders in shifting their strategies. And so strategies that bring in a traditional, linear, non-participatory approach, it just does not work. So our recommendation is seeking commitment from the funding communities to that they are committed to shifting their strategies, that they are committed to listening from activists and groups and communities who are demonstrating what does work and learning from them in consultation with them and while moving money to them. We also discussed building leadership of young activists as part of the overall efforts to redistribute power dynamics, promote meaningful participation, and strengthen accountability within the funding community. There is a need to prioritize funding to and through UN bodies and mechanisms with a decolonized lens and with the other recommendations that have come before this in order to work with states to increase accountability to human rights commitments. And we also discussed the need to strengthen accountability of governments themselves at regional levels and consider mechanisms that can be used at several levels, regional, national, as well as in the GEF, of which this consultation is part of. So these are the key recommendations that emerge from our discussion, Shalini.
Thanks, Nikita. Thanks a lot for giving an overview also. And I think it's a very fruitful discussion and you have come up with a strong, very clear recommendation. So thank you once again to you and all your group members also. Now I would like to invite group number 2 and who discuss create, expand and protect civic space for feminist action and organizing. And I will invite Cynthia to present their recommendation on behalf of group 2. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you very much, Shalini. Let me just pull this up. Okay, so for us, I just wanted to say from the outset, we definitely felt like there was not enough time to be able to properly discuss the issues and to be able to put forward some very good, robust recommendations. But this is some of the key highlights that came out of the breakout discussion. Perhaps we can have people mute their mic if they are not speaking. That would help because I hear a huge amount of background noise. Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, so in terms of what we had for the first one, Tess, is this ours? Sorry. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. So for the first, women and non-binary people face significant challenges in participating in political, economic, and social life as equal partners with men. We felt that there were restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, inequality, and gender-based violence, which we see increasing in the region. The ability of WHRDs and feminist organizations to reverse these trends is challenged by conservative funding modalities that limits women's opportunities to mobilize. Secondly, sociocultural norms are hampering gender equality and meaningful participation, and there is insufficient discussion on intersectional feminism. Attitudinal and behavioral change that combats harmful social norms are needed, and to break taboos as well for greater gender equality and more participation of women and non-binary people in all areas of life. As a movement, we are sometimes less inclusive than we think, and it is important that we ensure spaces are truly inclusive and that we always are able to speak and interact with those who claim to represent, who we claim to represent. So in other words, we are not in fact often actually even interacting with those that we are apparently giving voice to. Could you scroll down just a little bit, Tess, for me? Thank you. Women living in poverty and in rural areas face particular challenges in participating in public life and in feminist movements due to the lack of access to technology in an increasingly digital environment. And of course, COVID has brought that forward very clearly. So, and then in terms of key recommendations, we need to think about the long-term sustainability of the movement and think of the future generations of women, girls, and non-binary people. We need to address formal and informal structural barriers to participation. Feminist movements must talk to women and girls that they represent. We also need to be mindful of the diversity of women and girls that we claim to represent. Governments must be held accountable for the hostile environments that they're creating and that actually impede human rights defenders and women's movements from being able to operate in safety. We must find spaces for women to strategize safely in the global south, and we need more digital feminist security. Women human rights defenders and feminist movements must improve their digital security, and we must ensure that women, girls, and non-binary people without access to digital technology can meaningfully participate in the feminist movement and in public life. Governments must create safe spaces for women and girls to participate in, and women human rights defenders protected and supported when under threat. And finally, civil society needs to engage more with academia and the education sector, as this can play a very significant role in building a rights-based culture. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Cynthia. Thanks a lot. I think some people have also added some comments in the chat box. So one of the comment actually, Dipti is suggesting if we can also ensure preconditions for disability inclusion, inclusive budgeting for reasonably accommodate women, girls with various multiple and hidden disabilities in project cycle, developing disability disintegrated monitoring and evaluation indicators to collect data. So how data collection is also very important to some of the progress we want to make, and also inclusion and in creating more enabling environment, and also focusing on accessibility and inclusion. It will help us in building more in like accessible environment for everyone. So thanks a lot. I would invite Joy for presenting group number 3, and she will be talking about, okay, so over to Joy. You can share about your group theme also, and then you are ready to present. I would also, I just wanted to request your team member, other team member who were part of discussion team, so they can also switch on their camera so that we can also see who all were there to join.
Thank you. Yeah. We had a lot of people join us, about 50 over people, and it was a lovely opportunity for us to talk a little bit more about women. I mean, I think meaningful participation in leadership. And I would say that the first kind of framing question that we have here is that one of the biggest barriers to participation in public life is really the limits of our own imaginations of who can be a leader and what leadership looks like. And so I think we did talk a bit about how patriarchal culture in societies are not allowing women to take leadership roles, both in terms of the expectations about who would be able to sit in government, you know, the existence and the continued existence of manels, like panels that are made out exclusively of men, especially when they come to think about specific interests that are not seen as women's issues. And I think the other piece here is also thinking about how collective action can really change some of this. So the second insight is really around coalition solidarity and how important it is both for advocacy and awareness, and that when we see different coalitions being linked together and standing together, we are able to take better and clearer action. One big piece of this, and this is something that was brought up by the other actions, in the other groups as well, was the need to build environments that are inclusive for everyone to be able to participate. And I think that that actually was very well articulated in our group, especially around disability inclusion. In terms of kind of connections here around leadership, it's also really important to focus on the local, national, regional, and global levels, and then also back to global, regional, national, and local levels. It was a continuous loop. And there is a big need for a better connection among treaty bodies and the works, especially at the Commission of Status of Women in New York, as well as the CEDAW Committee, because all of these connections will help to strengthen normative and regulatory frameworks. And finally, we talked a little bit about temporary special measures, especially on how they can be very useful in terms of changing the laws and policies that are barriers to women's political participation. And also the question about saying, well, maybe they can be temporary and special, but hopefully these measures will stop being temporary and special as they become something that more and more people are able to imagine, and that becomes part of like social norms. As we look at the key recommendations, I think you know, one of the biggest recommendations that kind of rang through all of our discussions was the need to document the evidence of feminist leadership, the existence of it, and what the impact is, especially as because I think it also allows us to make a discussion about kind of making the case for why feminist leadership is very important. We also want to see more research being done, because it will inform feminist leaders on what the existing gaps are, but also allow them to build better strategies. Another key recommendation was to increase the availability of high quality financing in support of women's participation in public life. And that includes financing for the kind of capacity building and training that is necessary to be able to effectively participate, especially in politics and how you run a campaign, how do you make policy. And the last thing I think is the recommendation to reaffirm existing commitments to strengthen normative and regulatory frameworks, and a special focus on the way in which violence against women in the public life can really deter women from participating in public life. And to think about leadership in a more comprehensive way, both in terms of the life cycle from young and to aging, but also in terms of building up leadership that is from communities and that are also accountable to their constituencies, even as they may rise up in the regular power structures. Thanks very much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks a lot. And thanks to all your team members also. Actually, several suggestions are coming in the Zoom chat box also. People have been continuously sharing their reflections and comments. So I hope all of us are also taking notes of those suggestions. And I just wanted to also check with our tech team, because someone has written if the screen can be zoomed in because wordings are very slow. So maybe for some people it is very difficult to read. So maybe if it is possible, we can just increase the size of wordings zoomed in the screen. Now I would like to invite our group number 4. And the group number 4 facilitator is Relin. She is already here. So welcome, Renin, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Shalini. I was the facilitator for the 4th breakout group. We've had several participants coming from, of course, different organizations, and we've had very two inspiring young discussants, Yasmin Bijorin of SISTA, and Satoko Yamaguchi, who is a member of the Generation Equality Youth Task Force. So Satoko also kindly shared with us some of the highlights from the Generation Equality Forum in Mexico. So some of the reflections here and recommendations were also out of that forum. So there were a few challenges that were identified, focusing on how to strengthen adolescent girl-led, youth-led, and youth-serving movements in the region. Among the challenges were one, I think this is not only distinct to Vanuatu, but it was highlighted that language is also important if you want to change the narrative towards empowerment. So she shared, for instance, that feminists or feminism doesn't have a direct local language translation in Vanuatu, so that also somehow becomes not really a problem, but a challenge, to continue to advance that kind of discourse. And I can assume that it can be true in some cultures and countries also in the region. So that's one of the reflections or challenge that we've identified. There are still the usual view of how girls are being viewed by some cultures, and also, of course, the dynamics of the age. You are female and you are young, so why should we listen to you? So that's still identified as one of the challenges. And then also there were challenges when it comes to limited resources and funding to support young adolescent, youth, and feminist organizations, lack of capacity building for young activists, and tokenistic participation. So as you can see in the screen, there are a few recommendations from the group from the breakout group. So one is transforming power inequalities to effectively counter power imbalances for a fairer distribution of power. So there's a lot of power in that sentence. So basically what we'd like to do is to be able to challenge the power relations that would advance, of course, gender equality, especially giving space for young feminists. And to ask young people to give them a seat at the table. I think this has been mentioned in the previous presentations. To forego of tokenism, youth want co-ownership and co-leadership. So we usually listen to them, invite them in discussions, but what they want is to go beyond that and to have co-ownership and co-leadership. Youth activists need to be allocated a budget and strengthen their capacity. Involve young people or youth, especially young families, in co-designing accountability mechanisms, and involve them in monitoring the progress of actions that were identified. So there should be a space for them where they can contest decisions, to focus more on power within communities and not power over youth. So the idea is to have a bottom-up approach rather than us designing and then asking them, but maybe really come from the communities and young families themselves, basically to make the young voices heard. The importance of mentors in smaller context-specific countries. That's related to the 7th recommendation on intergenerational dialogue. I think that was already expounded by by the other facilitators. Then the next recommendation is on creating a safe space for young people to reflect and challenge the structural power related to the first recommendation, creating core flexible funding, also related to one of the recommendations that relate to funding. But this time, what we'd like to emphasize is that these funding should be able to respond to the needs identified by young feminists themselves. Non-youth, as being termed or coined as a term in the group, needs to be sensitized on how to work with young people, especially young feminists. And there should be a review of relevant existing policies to make them more responsive to the needs of young people and young women. So yeah, so these are the recommendations. I'd like to thank the participants in the breakout group and those who helped us, of course, Denise and all the others who were there during the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Renan. It was very informative, and also all of us are like getting big benefit from this discussion and sharing, listening to these recommendations. And I wanted to thank all of you, because it's also, I felt the way you have written all the recommendation, it is very clear cut, so there is no confusion and very focused recommendations we are pushing. So thanks a lot. And Hulda has been also reassuring all of us that all insights and recommendations will be shared with participants. So people can also maybe further, if they feel anything need to add, they can add and share information with Hulda. Now it is time for us to move to next section, and we will also again definitely find an opportunity to talk about how to get involved in some of the processes and what are the opportunity where people can try to get involved. Now, next section is call to action. So I wanted to invite Joy Chia. She was just here and I wanted to invite her again. And she's team manager for Women's Rights Program at Women's Society, Open Society Foundation as an Action Coalition leader. And she will be talking about how, as an Action Coalition leader, why they consider this Action Coalition to be very important. So Joy, over to you. Welcome again.
Thank you, and hi everyone. I think that's a presentation that I would like to use in terms of a PowerPoint. Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say that it's a real pleasure for me to be here and to be with all of you and talking about the Asia Pacific region in particular. I'm from Singapore and spent many years working on East Asia, and so even though right now I work in a global program, I think one of the things that's really important for me is recognizing that we all have the more diverse voices that are amplified in all of these spaces, the more robust and comprehensive the ways in which we can actually transform our futures will be. So why invest in feminist movements and leadership? I think this is actually one of the main reasons for us in terms of Open Society Foundations, in terms of why we wanted to be part of the GEF process. Yes, to the next page, please. The first part of this is that, we're making the case that open societies are gender just societies. And at the foundation, our mission to promote and defend inclusive, vibrant democracies and the right-based protection cannot succeed without robust feminist leadership and the movements that are on the front lines of rising authoritarianism. And so for us, this investment is an investment in transformative feminist leadership. Next slide, please. And so one of the questions that for us in terms of thinking about this commitment and why the Action Coalition has been so exciting is because it really has been a collective effort to think about what transformative feminist leadership looks like in practice. And I do want to say that for me, I think that transformative feminist leadership is certainly does require movements and a robust, vibrant feminist movement, but also for them that is all part and parcel of the same trajectory for me. So we believe that solutions to national, regional, and global challenges have to be innovative and inclusive, and that everyone should have a voice in shaping the policies that affect them. And we also understand the importance and the benefits of having feminist leadership in all areas of public life and creating an enabling environment for women and girls to take on the responsibilities of such leadership. And so when we think about this in three areas, I think the first is kind of ensuring that we have access to governance structures, and governance structures that not just in terms of politics, but also in terms of economics, in terms of work environments, and in terms of schools and institutions and everywhere. We also want to talk a little bit about the need to strengthen and resource inclusive movements and leadership. And we also know that transformation happens within and among individuals, within communities, within systems, and that feminist movements and leadership is essential for sparking that work, but also for sustaining that work. So that's a very important piece of why we are committed to this Action Coalition and in terms of what kind of commitments we are making. I think for us, the decision-making roles in public life is very important, not just because we believe that it's important to have different people who are making decisions, but actually because we believe that who is making decisions actually transforms the kinds of decisions that are made and the priorities for our communities. So our commitments are as follows. Could the next slide, please? So some of the commitments in particular for this Action Coalition that we are really excited about is around, firstly, to build transformative feminist political leadership, in which we are going to dedicate funding to explicitly invest in putting more women and girls in positions of leadership in politics and governance, and also investing in keeping them there. So that's the biggest piece that we feel is very important. We will have some commitments in terms of strengthening of feminist leadership in peace and security. And of course, in terms of resourcing inclusive movements and leadership. I also think another piece that is very important here is the strengthening of the global infrastructure for progressive multilateralism. And what we mean by that is preserving the space for feminist activists and movements to continue to engage at the multilateral level, because the vision of what is being asked is one that is open and inclusive. We see anti-gender and anti-rights movements as a key potential, a key threat to progressive multilateralism, and that is another reason why we are prioritizing it. To the next slide, please. I think for me, just to end in terms of the call for action, what could transformative feminist leadership commitments look like for you, for all of us here on the call today? We've been thinking a lot about this, and as a funder, of course, a lot of our commitments are about resourcing, but there actually is a lot of internal policies that all of us can really do to kind of build a robust and enabling environment for people to continue to participate in our organizations, but also in our communities. I mean, in terms of internal policies, it would be really important to have clear documentation and disaggregated data based on gender, so that we're able to understand whether or not we actually are doing a good job in encouraging and supporting and sustaining participation in our workforces. We also could look at policies, like the human resources policies, that can make a really big difference in how people engage, especially around like family burden and caregiving responsibilities. You know, looking at parental leave policies that encourage both women and all parents to take advantage of the leave in order to be able to provide caregiving. I think that there are other things to consider, and especially in terms of the items for many of us that we want to prioritize and think in terms of the commitments for advocacy. One of the key opportunities, I think, is for a commitment to transform digital civic spaces for feminist leadership and mobilization. So we could commit to ensuring security and protection for people who are engaging and organizing on digital platforms, but we can also commit to seeing these spaces as spaces where we actually have the agency and the power to change what that looks like. We can advocate with technology companies. We are not just passive subjects within that space, but really can invest in learning more and being able to engage with others so that we can take collective action to change our digital environments. And then I think the last thing that we could also consider in terms of commitments is thinking about who we talk to and who is part of our meetings, and how do we know that we are actually representing our constituencies. I take to heart a lot of the suggestions today in terms of inclusion from Indigenous, to ensure that our movements are just and inclusive and diverse, so including disability, people with disabilities, Indigenous leadership, people who are traditionally marginalized from because of race, ethnicity, in terms of religion, all of the other things, LGBTQ people, making sure that our movements are responsive to people and open to all, and being able to amplify the voices and their interests and their concerns would be actually, I think, one of the biggest commitments that we can make. And I'm very proud that this Action Coalition actually has a very explicit commitment to women and girls and non-binary people and all of their diversity. And that actually, I think, is a commitment that we could all make in terms of the work that we do, regardless of which sector we are from. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Zoe. Actually, the kind of issues that all issues you have raised in this session was really important. And I really like the way you highlighted issues related to technology, parents, caregiving. So how feminist transformative, what it looks like, and what all we should include, and how we need to become more and more inclusive is really important. And we need to be conscious in each and every situation. Thanks a lot, Joy. So I also wanted to share that we will be also sharing in the chat information on how you can be a commitment maker and how you can find some of the opportunities and spaces where you can engage, and how all of us can engage and find ways to contribute also in the process. So I just wanted to thank you, everyone. And after this session, actually, we have now come to the end of this dialogue. I wanted to especially acknowledge and say thank you to all our team members who have been helping us with interpretation, with sign language and translation with different languages. So their support has been really helpful for us. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you, our tech team, for the finalizing all the processes for this meeting, and this event has gone really smoothly. So thanks a lot all to you, our tech team members. And I really enjoy moderating this session today, and hopefully we will continue to be in touch and we can keep adding our contribution and keep finding spaces to be for contributing in this process. Thanks a lot. And the information related to Generation Equality Forum and engagement has been given in the chat box. So thank you, everyone.
What defines a generation?
Climate justice! Right now!
Is it just about the year you were born? Or is there something more? We may have lived through different decades, different circumstances, different countries, but we all share in the global, everyday push for our rights, for justice, for a world that is equal. Perhaps what defines our generation isn't our age or our background, but the line in the sand that we have drawn. We take to the streets to speak out against discrimination, and we work tirelessly behind the scenes. We stand up for peace.
We are fed up with the war
and economic justice. We start with a statement and watch it become a movement. We have come a long way, but the fight isn't over, and our rights are still under assault. It is time to take action. Let us be the wake-up call the world needs.
The eyes of all future generations are upon you.
Be the first, the youngest, the best, and then make sure no one is left behind. When someone tries to silence you, raise up your voice.
Let us wage a global struggle.
Change everything, or change just one thing. As long as you do something, whether you're new to changing the world or have been in the fight for a long time.
Each knows exactly why we are here.
We are all together, united for gender equality. And the future we create for women and girls is up to all of us.